The air in the glass-walled penthouse of the Carter Group in New York was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and impending death as David, the most powerful Korean CEO in the city, stood paralyzed before the barrel of a suppressed pistol. Any last words, David? Chris sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger while his team of elite assassins chuckled in the shadows of the dim lighting. But before the hammer could fall, a soft, melodic voice drifted through the room like a ghost, asking if everyone was having a party without her. Please subscribe to Melanin and the Mafia's Pack, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now let's continue. The assassins spun around, their heavy boots thumping against the polished marble, only to find a small black girl standing by the elevators, her hair tied in beautiful braids with gold clips that shimmered under the emergency lights. She was wearing a simple yellow sundress and clutching a worn-out teddy bear, looking entirely too innocent for a room filled with monsters. "Get lost, kid. This isn't a playground," Chris barked. But the girl, whose name was Mia, simply tilted her head and told him that she was there to do a job because her master said David was her new responsibility. The men erupted in laughter, mocking the idea of a 7-year-old being a bodyguard. But David felt a strange chill down his spine as he saw the girl's eyes glow with a fierce, ancient wisdom. "Mia, run," David shouted, his voice cracking, but she didn't move an inch. Instead, she whispered a single word into the darkness behind her, and the floor began to vibrate with a low, guttural growl that stopped every heart in the room. From the deep shadows of the hallway, a massive, golden-maned African lion emerged, its muscles rippling under its fur, and its eyes locked onto Chris with a hunger that defied logic. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a suffocating terror as the beast let out a roar so powerful it shattered the decorative crystal vases lining the walls. "Don't hurt the handsome man," Mia said softly, patting the lion's massive head as it prowled toward the assassins. "But the noisy ones need to learn some manners." In a blur of fur and claws, the penthouse became a theater of chaos. But for the viewers watching this unfold, this is just the beginning of a legend. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell for more of the pack's journey. David watched in disbelief as his would-be killers, men who had survived wars and street battles, scrambled like terrified rats to escape a predator they couldn't possibly defeat. One man tried to raise his rifle, but with a speed that defied the human eye, Mia flicked a small pebble from her pocket, striking his wrist with the force of a bullet and sending the weapon clattering across the floor. "Master told me that greed makes people stupid," Mia noted as she walked calmly toward David, the lion trailing behind her like a loyal shadow. She reached into her small pouch and pulled out a lollipop, offering it to the stunned CEO, whose life she had just saved in the blink of an eye. "I'm Mia, and this is my friend," she said, pointing to the beast that was now licking its paws over a pile of unconscious men. David couldn't understand where she came from or why a child held the power to command the king of the jungle. But as he looked into her calm, fearless eyes, he knew his world had changed forever. He remembered the legend his father once told him about the Carter bloodline and a protector who would appear when the shadows grew too long. Could this little girl be the key to everything he had lost? But there was no time for questions because the city lights were flickering, and a new wave of sirens echoed from the streets of Manhattan below. "We have to go, Boss Daddy," Mia said, using the name that would soon become David's favorite title, "because more bad guys are coming, and Aslan hasn't had his dinner yet." David took her small hand, feeling a surge of warmth he hadn't felt in years, and as they stepped into the private elevator, he realized the Mafia wasn't just facing a bodyguard, they were facing a force of nature. Little did he know that Chris was already calling for backup, or that a mysterious figure known as the Shadow was watching them from a hidden camera, smiling at the chaos. The elevator began its descent, leaving behind a ruined office and a message that would soon shake the entire New York underworld. The CEO was no longer alone. As they reached the lobby, David saw his head of security, Paul, standing there with his jaw dropped, unable to comprehend the sight of a lion stepping out of the elevator. "Is that a real lion, sir?" Paul stammered, reaching for his holster, but Mia stepped in front of David and told him to be nice because Aslan didn't like the smell of fear. David told Paul to get the armored SUV ready and to cancel all meetings because he had a new mission: to find out who this girl was and why she called him her destiny. As they sped through the rainy streets of New York, Mia fell asleep against David's arm, her tiny hand still clutching his suit jacket, while the lion stared out the window at the passing skyscrapers. David looked at the pouch around her neck, noticing a familiar crest that made his blood run cold. It was the same mark his mother had worn before she disappeared 20 years ago. The mystery was deepening with every mile they traveled toward his safe house in Connecticut, and he knew that the war for the Carter Group had only just begun. But for the first time in his life, David didn't feel afraid of the dark, because the little girl by his side carried the light of 1,000 suns and the fury of a wild kingdom. He leaned back and closed his eyes, wondering what other secrets were hidden in the mountains where Mia had been raised. What he didn't realize was that the pouch was starting to glow with a soft, pulsing light, reacting to his presence in a way that would soon unlock memories he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. The journey ahead was filled with fire and blood, but with the little bodyguard and her lion, the Mafia's reign of terror was about to reach its violent end. Stay tuned, because what happens will change your perception of power forever. The heavy iron gates of the Connecticut estate creaked open like the jaws of a titan as David's armored convoy rolled onto the sprawling grounds, the moonlight reflecting off the polished black paint while the silent woods whispered secrets only the wind could understand. Inside the lead SUV, the tension was thick enough to choke a man, but Mia was fast asleep with her head in David's lap, her breathing soft and rhythmic as if she hadn't just unleashed a predator on the city's most feared hitman. David looked down at her small, innocent face, then shifted his gaze to the rearview mirror where Aslan's golden eyes glowed from the back of the vehicle, a silent guardian that made even the toughest security detail sweat through their suits. As they pulled up to the front of the colonial mansion, a sharp-featured woman with fiery red hair and eyes like polished emeralds stood waiting on the porch, her fingers dancing across a high-tech tablet with a speed that suggested she lived in a world of code and shadows. This was Sandra, a former elite hacker for the Shadow Syndicate who had been caught by David months ago and spared only because of her genius-level intellect. And now she was the only person David trusted to manage his digital fortress. "You're late, David, and the dark web is buzzing with the news that you've hired a child as a mercenary," Sandra said, her voice dry as bone. But she stopped dead when the rear door opened and a full-grown lion stepped out onto the gravel. Paul, the head of security, stepped forward with his hand on his weapon, still trembling from the events in New York, but David raised a hand to stop him because he knew that any sudden move could turn the lawn into a graveyard. Mia woke up with a wide yawn, rubbing her eyes and asking if they were finally at the cookie house her master had promised her, completely ignoring the stunned expressions of the armed guards surrounding her. She skipped toward Sandra, looking at the tablet and pointing to a specific line of code that was causing a minor lag in the security perimeter, whispering that if Sandra moved the decimal point, the bad guys wouldn't be able to see the invisible door. Sandra's jaw dropped as she realized the 7-year-old had just solved an encryption problem that had stumped her for 3 hours. But before she could ask how, Mia was already asking for a giant bowl of beef noodles because a saving boss daddy is hungry work. As they entered the grand kitchen, David watched the surreal sight of a little girl sitting at a marble island while a 5-star chef frantically prepared a meal that could feed 3 grown men, all while a lion rested its heavy chin on the countertop. But the peace was short-lived because Sandra's tablet began to chime with a low, ominous frequency, indicating that a fleet of stealth drones was approaching the estate from the direction of the Long Island Sound. "They're not waiting for morning, David," Sandra warned, her face turning pale as she realized the Mafia had mobilized a paramilitary unit to finish what they started in the penthouse. David felt a familiar coldness spreading through his veins, a symptom of the ice marrow condition his doctors said would eventually kill him. But Mia suddenly jumped down from her stool and placed a small, warm hand on his chest. "Don't be scared, boss daddy. The noisy bees are just coming to play," she said, her voice losing its childish lilt and taking on a tone of command that made the air in the room vibrate. She turned to Aslan and gave a sharp whistle, and the lion immediately sprinted toward the back gardens, its body becoming a blur of gold against the dark trees. Mia told Sandra to give her the tablet, and with a few taps that seemed more like magic than programming, she took control of the estate's defense system, turning the automated turrets into a synchronized orchestra of precision. Outside, the drones were plucked from the sky one by one, exploding in silent bursts of orange flame, while the mercenaries lurking in the woods found themselves being hunted by a predator that didn't show up on their thermal goggles. One by one, the comms of the attackers went silent, replaced by the terrifying sound of a lion's roar echoing through the Connecticut hills, sending a message to the shadow that their prey was no longer defenseless. "Who taught you this, Mia?" David asked, his voice filled with awe and a growing sense of dread, but she only smiled and said her master told her that the world was just a big puzzle and she was the piece that didn't fit. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a small, bitter-smelling herb, telling David to chew it because his cold heart was trying to sleep too early. As he swallowed the medicine, David felt the icy pain in his chest vanish instantly, replaced by a surge of vitality that made his vision sharper and his mind clearer than it had been in years. But as he looked at Mia, he saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes, a look that said she knew more about his family's dark past than he did, and he realized the master she spoke of must have been the one who took her from his mother's arms all those years ago. The mystery of the Carter bloodline was beginning to unfold, but the Mafia was already preparing their most dangerous weapon, a man known as the chemist who specialized in toxins that could kill even a king. Sandra reported that a message had been intercepted from the New York underground, a bounty of $50 million placed not on David's head, but on Mia's, because the Shadow realized she was the true threat to their empire. David felt a protective fury rise within him, a fatherly instinct he hadn't known he possessed, and he vowed that he would burn the city to the ground before he let anyone touch a hair on her head. "We aren't hiding anymore," David declared, his voice booming through the mansion. "If they want a war with the pack, we'll give them one they'll never survive." But as the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate, a black helicopter appeared on the radar, not belonging to the Mafia, but to the federal government, led by a man named Chris who had been looking for Mia for a long time. The stakes were rising higher than any skyscraper in Manhattan, and as Mia looked up at the approaching aircraft, she whispered that the big bird was coming to take her back to the mountain. David gripped her hand tightly, knowing that the battle for her freedom was just beginning, and that the secret of her origin was about to be revealed in the most violent way possible. If you want to see how the pack handles a government takedown and a Mafia betrayal at the same time, don't miss the next chapter of this epic journey. The world thinks they know what a little girl is capable of, but they are about to learn that when you mess with the daughter of a king, you face the fury of the jungle. Stay tuned, because the real truth about David's mother is hidden in a vault that only Mia's lion can open. The morning sun hit the steel and glass of the Carter Group headquarters in Washington, D.C., like a blade, but inside the executive boardroom, the temperature was sub-zero as David walked in with a confidence that felt like a death sentence to the 12 board members seated around the mahogany table. Every eye in the room flickered with a mix of greed and fear because they had all seen the headlines about the Penthouse Massacre, yet none of them expected to see a 7-year-old girl in a designer blazer walking at David's side, while a 500-pound lion padded silently behind them, its claws clicking rhythmically against the expensive carpet. "This is a place of business, David, not a circus." Chris, the senior vice president, sneered as he adjusted his silk tie, but his voice cracked when Aslan let out a low vibration from his chest that made the water in the glasses on the table ripple like a miniature earthquake. David didn't sit in his usual chair. Instead, he stood at the head of the table and leaned forward, his eyes scanning the faces of the men and women who had been secretly voting to sell his company to the Shadow Syndicate behind his back. Mia didn't say a word. She simply climbed onto the table and began to walk across it, her small shoes leaving faint prints on the polished wood as she approached Chris, who was sweating so profusely that his collar was soaked through. She stopped right in front of him and pulled a small, silver flash drive from her pocket, the one Sandra had encrypted with a trapdoor virus that only Mia knew how to trigger, and she asked Chris why he had been sending love letters to a man named the Chemist in New York. The room went silent as a grave as David gestured to the massive monitors on the wall, which suddenly flared to life with intercepted emails, bank transfers, and high-definition photos of Chris meeting with Mafia hitmen in a dark alley in Georgetown. Chris tried to stand up, his face turning a sickly shade of purple as he shouted that this was a setup and that a child's word meant nothing in a court of law. But Mia simply tapped her chin and told him that the pigeon he sent yesterday didn't make it to its destination. Outside the soundproof glass, the board members could see federal agents from the D.C. field office swarming the hallway, led by a man named David who had finally decided to pick a side in the war for the Carter legacy. Chris reached for a hidden panic button under the table, but before his finger could even brush the plastic, Aslan lunged with a speed that blurred the air, his massive paw pinning Chris's arm to the mahogany with enough pressure to make the bone groan but not break. "The lion doesn't like liars, Chris, and neither do I," David said, his voice as cold as the ice marrow flowing through his veins. "So you're going to tell me exactly where the shadow is hiding, or I'll let my bodyguard's friend finish his breakfast." The other board members scrambled to get away from the table, but Paul and his security team blocked the exits, their weapons drawn and their faces set in grim determination as they realized the CEO was finally purging the rot from his empire. Chris began to babble, his arrogance shattered into 1,000 pieces of cowardice, as he confessed that the Shadow wasn't just a rival, but a member of the Carter family who had been presumed dead for 2 decades. Mia looked at David, her eyes filled with a sudden, sharp clarity, and she whispered that the bad uncle was waiting in a bunker beneath a lighthouse in Washington state, the very place where David's father had been murdered. The revelation hit David like a physical blow, making his heart hammer against his ribs, but Mia reached out and took his hand, her warmth acting as a shield against the cold poison of the past. "We have the data, we have the traitor, and now we have a destination," David declared, looking at the cowering board members and telling them that their resignations would be on his desk by noon or they would share Chris's fate in a federal prison. As the agents dragged Chris away in handcuffs, Sandra appeared on the screen from the Connecticut estate, reporting that the Big Bird helicopter from earlier had been tracked to a private airfield owned by the same Uncle Mia had just identified. The trap was set, but David knew that going to the lighthouse meant walking into the heart of the enemy's power, a place where the rules of the city didn't apply and where the law of the jungle was the only thing that mattered. "Pack your bags, Mia," David said, a dark fire burning in his eyes. "We're going to Washington to meet family." Mia nodded, a fierce smile playing on her lips as she hopped off the table and told Aslan it was time for a long walk. But as they left the boardroom, David noticed a small, red appearing on the back of Mia's jacket. He tackled her to the floor just as a high-caliber sniper round shattered the reinforced glass, sending a shower of diamonds across the room and plunging the Carter group into total chaos once again. But as the alarms began to blare, Mia didn't cry or scream. She simply looked at the hole in the window and told David that the Shadow Man was a very bad shot and that she was going to have to teach him a lesson he would never forget. The war had just moved from the boardroom to the battlefield, and the world was about to see that a little girl and a lion were more than a match for any assassin's bullet. The rugged coastline of Washington state was a jagged wall of gray rock and crashing white foam as the Carter Group's private tilt-rotor aircraft descended through a thick veil of mist toward the isolated lighthouse on the edge of the world. David sat in the cockpit, his jaw tight as he stared at the red beacon pulsing in the darkness, while behind him, Mia was busy sharpening a small wooden dagger her master had given her, her movements precise and deadly for a child of her age. Sandra's voice crackled through the comms from 3,000 miles away, warning them that the lighthouse wasn't just a building, but a reinforced fortress equipped with surface-to-air missiles and a private army of mercenaries. "They know you're coming, David, and the chemist has deployed a neurotoxin into the ventilation system of the bunker," Sandra said, her voice trembling with a rare touch of fear. But David simply looked at Mia, who was already putting on a small, high-tech respirator she had modified herself. As the aircraft touched down on the narrow landing pad, the wind howling like a wounded animal, the heavy steel doors of the lighthouse base slid open to reveal a line of soldiers in black tactical gear, their rifles leveled at the heart of the CEO. But David didn't step out first. Instead, he pushed a button on the cargo ramp, and Aslan charged out into the storm, a golden bolt of lightning that tore through the front line before the mercenaries could even register the threat. The sound of gunfire was drowned out by the roar of the ocean and the fury of the beast, but as David and Mia stepped onto the wet concrete, the ground beneath them suddenly shifted, revealing a massive elevator platform that began to drop them into the earth. "Welcome home, nephew." A voice boomed over the intercom, a voice that sounded like David's father but twisted by decades of hatred and isolation. "I've been waiting 20 years to see if you were worthy of the blood in your veins." They descended into a vast, subterranean laboratory filled with glowing blue tanks and humming servers, the very place where the Carter secrets had been weaponized into a nightmare. In the center of the room stood a man named Chris, not the board member from DC, but the original Chris, the uncle who had staged his own death to build a shadow empire from the ruins of his brother's legacy. He was holding a small, crystal vial filled with a shimmering gold liquid, the solar essence, that was the only cure for David's ice marrow condition and the ultimate prize of the Carter bloodline. "The girl is a miracle, isn't she?" Chris mused, looking at Mia with a predatory fascination. "The perfect blend of the mountain's ancient strength and our family's intellectual fire." Mia stood her ground, her hand resting on the hilt of her dagger and her eyes locked on the vial, telling him that a man who hides in a hole is not a king, but a worm. Chris laughed, a dry, rattling sound that echoed off the cold steel walls, and he signaled for his elite guards to surround them. But he didn't count on Sandra's final gift. From the shadow of the elevator, two figures emerged, Paul and the hacker Sandra herself, who had flown in secret to provide ground support, carrying an electromagnetic pulse device that could fry every server in the bunker. "It's over, Uncle," David said, his voice echoing with a power that filled the room. "The secrets of the Carter family belong to the world now, not your private laboratory." But Chris simply smiled and pressed a button on his remote, triggering a countdown on the bunker's self-destruct system and releasing the chemist's deadliest toxin into the air. The room began to fill with a green, swirling gas, and David felt his lungs begin to seize as the ice marrow in his chest reacted to the poison. But Mia suddenly lunged forward with a speed that defied gravity. She didn't go for the exit. She went for her uncle, her small body a blur of yellow fabric and gold braids as she tackled the man twice her size and snatched a vial of solar essence from his hand. Aslan let out a roar that shook the very foundation of the lighthouse, leaping over the guards to protect the girl as she scrambled back to David's side. "Drink it, Boss Daddy," she screamed over the sound of the crumbling ceiling, forcing the gold liquid down David's throat just as the first of the explosions rocked the laboratory. David felt a wave of heat wash through him, the ice in his veins melting into a river of fire that gave him the strength to stand and fight like he never had before. He grabbed Mia and signaled for Paul and Sandra to run for the elevator, while behind them, Chris was lost in a cloud of falling debris and green gas, screaming about a legacy that was turning into ash. They reached the surface just as the lighthouse itself began to tilt into the sea, a pillar of fire rising into the Washington sky to signal the end of the Shadow Syndicate. As they stood on the cliffside, watching the ruins sink into the dark water, David looked at Mia and realized she wasn't just his bodyguard. She was his salvation, the daughter he never knew he had, and the future he was now determined to protect. But as the sun began to rise over the Pacific, a small, black bird circled above them, carrying a message from a mountain they had yet to conquer, and Mia whispered that her master was coming to take her back. David squeezed her hand, knowing that the real war was just beginning and that the mystery of the Melanin and the Mafia was far deeper than any lighthouse bunker. The air in the California hills was heavy with the scent of wild sage and expensive rubber as David's convoy wound its way toward a secluded monastery hidden in the heart of the redwood forest, a place that didn't appear on any map and was protected by an invisible grid of high-frequency sensors. David sat in the back of the lead car, his hand never leaving the grip of his sidearm, while Mia stared out the window with a look of profound melancholy, knowing that the man she called master was not just her teacher, but the person who had orchestrated her separation from her family. Sandra, sitting in the front with a laptop that was now patched directly into the monastery's ancient security system, reported that the Big Bird helicopters from the federal agency were already hovering in the area, led by a man named David who was determined to seize Mia for national security interests. They think she's a weapon, David, and they'll kill anyone who stands in the way of their prize, Sandra warned, her fingers flying across the keys to disable the monastery's automated crossbows. As they pulled into the central courtyard, a man in simple white robes stood waiting for them, his face a mask of serene power that made Aslan lower his head in a rare sign of submission. This was the Master, a man whose name was forgotten by history, but whose influence had shaped the destiny of the Carter family for 3 generations. "You have done well to bring her back, David," the Master said, his voice like the low hum of a Tibetan singing bowl. "But the world is not ready for the light she carries, and the shadow you destroyed was only a fragment of the darkness that seeks her." Mia stepped out of the car, her yellow dress torn and her gold braids dusty from the battle at the lighthouse, and she asked the Master why he had lied to her about her father being dead. The Master didn't flinch. He simply gestured toward the ancient stone temple behind him and said that a seed must be buried in the dark before it can reach for the sun, and that David needed to be tested by fire before he could lead the pack. But the reunion was cut short as the sky erupted with the roar of jet engines, and the courtyard was suddenly illuminated by a dozen high-powered searchlights from the federal tactical teams. "Give us the girl, David, and we'll let you keep the company." The voice of the agent boomed from a megaphone, but David stepped in front of Mia and told them that the Carter Group was nothing compared to the life of his daughter. The tactical teams began their fast rope descent, their black silhouettes dropping from the sky like spiders, but the Master simply raised his hand, and the very trees around the monastery seemed to come alive, their massive branches swinging with a force that knocked the helicopters off balance. In the chaos, Mia turned to Sandra and told her to activate the Eclipse Protocol, a hidden command she had buried in the Carter Group servers that would erase every trace of her existence from the global database. David watched as his daughter, a child who should have been playing with dolls, directed a battle that spanned from the digital world to the physical one, her mind a supercomputer of tactical brilliance. Aslan lunged at a federal agent who had managed to land in the courtyard, his roar echoing through the redwoods as he defended the perimeter with a ferocity that made the elite soldiers retreat in terror. "You taught her too well, Master," David shouted over the din of the battle. "But you forgot to teach her that a father's love is a force even you can't control." David charged into the fray, his movements fluid and powerful thanks to the solar essence, taking down agents with a precision that showed he was truly a king of the pack. But as the battle reached its peak, a sniper from a distant ridge fired a shot aimed directly at the Master's heart, a shot that would have ended the legend then and there if Mia hadn't thrown her wooden dagger with a strength that intercepted the bullet in midair. The Master looked at her, a flicker of genuine emotion finally breaking through his mask of stone, and he realized that the student had surpassed the teacher in the only way that mattered: mercy. He turned to David and handed him a small, black jade key, telling him that this was the final piece of the Carter puzzle and that it would unlock the vault in New York where his mother's true testament was hidden. "Go now, while the forest protects your retreat," the Master commanded, his robes billowing in the wind as he prepared to face the rest of the federal army alone. David grabbed Mia and Aslan, piling them into the car as Sandra and Paul cleared a path through the flaming debris of the courtyard. As they sped away from the monastery, the sounds of the battle fading into the distance, David looked at the black key in his hand and then at the girl sleeping soundly by his side. They were no longer just a CEO and a bodyguard. They were a family on the run, and the world was about to find out that the true power of the Carter bloodline wasn't in wealth or weapons, but in the unbreakable bond of the pack. The night sky over Manhattan was a canvas of deep violet and flickering gold as David's convoy made its final, daring return to the city where it all began, the skyscrapers standing like silent sentinels over a kingdom that was about to be reclaimed. They didn't go to the Carter Group headquarters. Instead, they headed for an abandoned subway terminal beneath the New York Public Library, a place where the city's history was buried in dust and shadows. Sandra, her face illuminated by the blue light of her laptop, reported that the federal agency had declared David a fugitive and that every police officer in the tri-state area was looking for a Korean man and a little black girl with a lion. "Let them look," David said, his voice steady as he stepped onto the rusted tracks, leading the way with a high-powered flashlight, while Aslan's eyes reflected the beam like two burning suns. They reached a massive, circular vault door made of reinforced titanium and engraved with the same crest that was on Mia's pouch, a door that had been sealed since the day David's mother disappeared. David inserted the black jade key into the lock, and the ground beneath them began to hum with a deep, resonant frequency as the ancient mechanisms began to turn for the first time in 20 years. Inside, the vault was not filled with gold or jewels, but with thousands of glass cylinders containing the life data of every member of the Carter bloodline, a biological archive of their history, their strengths, and their sacrifices. In the center of the room was a holographic projection of David's mother, her image shimmering with a warmth that brought tears to David's eyes as she spoke of a day when the pack would be reunited and the shadows would finally be driven back. "Mia is the bridge, David," the hologram whispered, her voice like a memory of a lullaby. "She is the one who will lead the Carter family into a new era of peace, but only if you have the courage to let the world see her for who she truly is." Suddenly, the vault's sensors blared a warning. The federal agency, led by the relentless agent David, had tracked their signal and was now blowing the entrance to the subway terminal. "We have nowhere left to run, Boss Daddy," Mia said, her voice calm as she looked at the heavy steel door that was now being hammered by thermal charges. David looked at his daughter, then at the lion, and finally at the archive of his ancestors, and he realized that the time for hiding was over. He turned to Sandra and told her to broadcast a live, unhackable feed to every television, smartphone, and billboard in the world, using the vault's satellite uplink to bypass any government censorship. "People of the world, my name is David Carter, and I am not a fugitive," he began, his face appearing on every screen from Times Square to Tokyo. "I am a father, and this is the truth they tried to kill." He told the story of the Shadow Syndicate, the corruption in the federal agency, and the miracle of the little girl who had saved his life and his soul. As the tactical teams finally breached the vault door, their weapons ready and their orders to neutralize the target clear, they stopped dead in their tracks as they saw the millions of people around the world watching their every move in real time. Agent David stepped forward, his face pale as he realized that the war of shadows had been lost the moment the light was turned on. Mia walked toward him, her lion at her side and her hand extended in a gesture of peace, telling him that a man who serves the truth has nothing to fear from the pack. The weapons were lowered, the cuffs were never snapped, and the Melanin and the Mafia saga reached its climax not in blood, but in a revolution of transparency that toppled the Shadow Syndicate overnight. Months later, as the sun set over a new, peaceful estate in Washington, D.C., David sat on the porch with Mia and Aslan, watching as Sandra and Paul coordinated the global charity foundation that the Carter Group had become. The ice marrow was gone, cured by the solar essence and the joy of a life reclaimed, and the name Carter was now synonymous with justice instead of greed. Mia looked up from her book, her gold braids shimmering in the twilight, and asked if they could go back to the mountain for a visit to see if the master had found any new cookies. David laughed, pulling her into a warm embrace and telling her that as long as the pack was together, every day was a journey to the top of the world. "I love you, Boss Daddy," Mia whispered, her eyes reflecting the stars that were starting to appear in the clear New York sky. "I love you too, my little bodyguard," David replied, knowing that the story of the girl and her lion was a legend that would be told for generations to come, a testament to the power of love over hate and the strength of a family that refused to be broken. The world was finally at peace, but as the camera pans out over the glowing city, a single, golden eye blinks from the shadows of the park, reminding everyone that the pack is always watching, always protecting, and always ready for the next adventure. If you loved this epic conclusion to the Melanin and the Mafia's pack, make sure to subscribe, like, comment, legend below, and share this with your friends, because the story of David and Mia is just getting started in a whole new world of mystery. Stay tuned for the next video.